Okay, my watch says 3:30, so let's get started, shall we? My name is Bryce Wakefield. I'm the new associate at the Asia program here at the Woodrow Wilson Centre. My focus is on Northeast Asia. I'd like to remind everybody today that we're going to be webcast. This webcast will be going out live. So if possible, I'd like you to turn off your cell phones or electronic devices because they may interfere with the signal. And although many of you here will have come to these events before, because we're being webcast, I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce the Woodrow Wilson Centre. The Woodrow Wilson International Centre for Scholars is the official memorial to the 28th President of the United States. It was established by an act of Congress in 1968 to commemorate the ideals and concerns of Woodrow Wilson. Unlike most memorials to world leaders or to US presidents that you'll see around Washington, it's a living memorial, and it attempts to highlight the two principles that Woodrow Wilson held dear. That is a commitment to good scholarship and a commitment to good policy making. And the hope is that each of these principles will help to inform the other at the centre. Okay, our event today, if you've got the flyer, is how South Korea views the rise of China. It's an event hosted by the Asia program of the Woodrow Wilson Centre, and it's in conjunction with the Kissinger Institute, which is our institute which focuses on the US-China relationship. We'll have a number of speakers today focusing on different aspects of this relationship, particularly how the relationship is viewed from the South Korean side of things. And in order that we can get started straight away, I'll introduce each of them in turn, although you have their bios on the back of the event flyer. I'll ask each speaker to speak for around 20 minutes, and then we can have a Q&A session towards the end, and I promise I'll get you out by 5:30 p.m. so you can enjoy the rest of this magnificent weather. So, without much ado, our first speaker is Scott Snyder, and he's going to be focusing on how Korea has been viewing China, particularly through the economic sphere. Scott is currently director of the of U.S. Korea policy at the Asia Foundation. Yeah. However, he's recently been named adjunct senior fellow for Korea Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and he's also the author of the recently published book, China's Rise and the Two Koreas. So, Scott, I'll ask you to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Bryce, and it's a great opportunity to be here at the Wilson Center. I need to move this down.
Pull that down first.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to cover primarily the economic aspect of South Korean views of China, and I want to begin by saying that initially what drove China's decision to normalize relations with South Korea was really, I think, primarily economic factors. I don't know if this is... do I just have to hit continue or...
Yeah.
Oh
dear.
Okay.
Oh, here we go.
Here we go. So just to kind of lay the groundwork for that, the normalization of relations between China and South Korea was really driven by, I think, primarily economic factors. China and North Korea had been long-standing ideological partners, but as the expectation of increased opportunities in terms of trade and investment became clear in the early 1990s, it became more and more difficult for China to resist the opportunity to develop an economic and political relationship with South Korea. And so really, I think the driver for this relationship over the course of the past 15 years has been primarily economic. Just to highlight a few major events over that period, 1992, of course, was normalization. 2004, China replaced the United States as South Korea's biggest trading partner and also its biggest destination for foreign direct investment. And then I think a statistic that I find particularly interesting, there's almost 6 million visitors between China and South Korea now each year. In 2007, that 4.78 million South Koreans who visited China represent essentially 10% of South Korea's population going to China every year. So we're seeing a tremendous, I think, development in terms of person-to-person interactions that was originally driven by economic factors. And another fact that I found interesting, 830 flights a week between China and South Korea. That's twice as many as between South Korea and Japan. I was recently at a conference in South Korea where I heard a Chinese visitor to South Korea talk about her first visit to South Korea back in 1993. And what she talked about was having to fly from Beijing to Tokyo to Seoul. It took the entire day. And now, of course, you can jump from Beijing to Seoul in just a matter of a few hours. When I was a student in South Korea in the late 1980s, it was routine to hear Koreans refer to communist China, Red China. That was just a standard practice. And of course, most South Koreans hadn't had a chance to visit, but now this new world has opened up. And then another factoid that I think became clear, in particular last year in conjunction with the passing through of the Olympic torch through Seoul, was that there are a lot of Chinese students in South Korea, and many of them came out for the torch run. And in fact, there was a kind of set of incident related to Chinese students who were not happy with some of the other expressions related to North Korean refugees and related to Tibet that were kind of expressed alongside the torch run. An illustration of the way in which the economic relationship has developed. Well, you see it there. It's been a remarkable transformation from a two-way trade relationship that was about $6 billion in 1992 to one that was almost $150 billion last year. There are a couple of developments in the economic relationship that I think are particularly instructive as we look at this history, and that's what I really want to focus on. And this particular set of issues is, I think, especially illustrative because in both cases they relate to food. In 2000-2001 period, there was an incident in the China-South Korea economic relationship that was known as the Garlic Wars. And this particular issue arose because low-priced Chinese garlic was flooding the South Korean market. And this was before China had entered into the WTO. So the South Koreans were struggling with what are we going to do with all these this low-priced garlic entering the South Korean market. So they put these incredible 300% duties onto Chinese garlic. Well, the Chinese responded very simply with a very strong response, orders of magnitude greater, and that is that they basically threatened to shut down the millions of dollars of telecommunications trade, especially mobile phone trade that South Korea was doing with China at that particular time. Following China's entry into the WTO in 2001, we see that there's a tremendous growth in China-South Korea trade. But there's also another food war that I find very instructive, and that is what I like to call the kimchi wars. Because a few years ago, I think it was 2004, 2005 period, there was a big issue related to food safety. And of course, this is resonant, I think, now globally in terms of Chinese product safety. The problem was that there were some eggs that had been found in kimchi that had been imported from China to South Korea. The Korea Food and Drug Administration discovered that some of these products, contained some unhealthy eggs that were from pests. And so this became a big issue. After all, kimchi is South Korea's #1 food, arguably. And several facts came to light in this context. One, the initial response was outrage. How dare the Chinese send this egg-infested kimchi? But then it was discovered that, well, actually, more kimchi is being made and imported into Korea from China than is being made in Korea. And it's Korean firms that were doing the importing. They had gone and set up farms and were producing cabbage and then preparing the kimchi and sending it to South Korea. So it was really South Korean firms that were complicit in this context. But what I find really interesting was, of course, this made the news and the Chinese had to respond. And of course, we know that back in 2000, 2001, they responded very strongly with the sledgehammer effect. But then, as a member of the WTO, there were constraints in terms of how China could respond. And so I found China's response quite interesting. They banned exports of several South Korean firms, food production firms, to China in response. The only thing about it was that none of those South Korean firms were exporting to China. And so I think that was a pretty brilliant way of trying to show some kind of response. But more importantly, I think that it shows the significance of the international trade system and the WTO as a source of confidence that has allowed the China-South Korea economic relationship to grow in this particular way. That particular growth has really, I think, overwhelmed many of the political and security issues that could have been sticking points in the relationship. Now, that's not to say that the growth in the trade relationship has been all easy. In fact, in 2002 and 2003, after China joined the WTO, interestingly enough, China and South Korea were the two leading countries that were charging that the other country was dumping products in their country. And so I think that, that's also interesting because many times we think of the Asian context as maybe not so litigious or not so prone to utilize these regulatory mechanisms, but in fact, in the areas of steel and the areas of petrochemicals, there's a very active effort on the part of both China and South Korea to protect their market respectively from dumping. Now, there's another change that is not quite reflected on this particular graph that I think is important. It really has occurred just within the past 2 or 3 years, and that is the emergence in South Korea of what was referred to back in 2006 as a China threat. And we've heard that word China threat a lot in the West, in the United States, and in Japan, referring to a Chinese security threat. But I think what's interesting about the South Korean context is that at least in 2006, the China threat was really focused purely on China as a threat to South Korean economic growth. And in particular, South Koreans were losing share in third country markets to Chinese firms that were basically outcompeting South Korean firms in those markets. Secondly, South Korea, throughout this time period, had been running a very high surplus. South Korea had been running a very high surplus with China, a very high trade surplus with China. That started to get cut as Chinese firms became more competitive. And I think that probably one of the facts that really gained South Korean attention in this respect was that South Korean major firms, especially in the shipbuilding and automotive sectors, began to buy Chinese low-cost steel instead of Korean steel because China's steel was more competitive in terms of just the basic product. And so I think that this really induced a certain level of anxiety on the part of South Koreans about the prospect of economic dependency on China. Now, we see a very similar picture in terms of what has happened in South Korean foreign direct investment in China. 2004, 2005, we see very high levels of South Korean foreign direct investment in China. This has been the story, I think, behind a lot of the person-to-person interaction that we have seen in the first slide. But what is particularly notable, by 2004, 2005, South Korea was, in fact, China's third largest source of foreign direct investment, behind Hong Kong and the Virgin Islands. And we know that a lot of those first two sources are really round-trip investments. So the South Koreans had really carved out this role very heavily tied in to the Chinese economy in terms of investment. And a lot of this is automobile sector, et cetera. The South Korean experience in terms of trying to move into those larger sectors, automobile sector, telecommunications sector, really it's the story of South Korea trying to transition from being involved with China as a base for low labor cost, low land cost export to the United States, to exporting product to the Chinese market. It's a big challenge that a lot of the South Korean firms faced. One, the Chinese increasingly negotiated tougher terms in terms of technology transfer to China. But they also faced some problems in terms of industrial espionage for some of the South Korean firms that were based in China. And my favorite story in this respect was when the Hyundai and Kia executives went to a trade show in China, and they discovered that the model that they were designing for their next year was already on display at this particular trade show, but under the name of a Chinese company. Likewise, the South Koreans have faced challenges in terms of how they handle inward Chinese foreign direct investment. Maybe a good analogy for this from a U.S. perspective would be the whole issue with CNOOC and Unocal a few years ago. But back in 2004, the South Koreans approved an investment in China, or an investment from China's Shanghai Automotive Company to purchase SsangYong Motors. I think this particular interaction is really quite interesting. It's really the first major Chinese investment in a South Korean firm. There was a lot of suspicion on the part of South Korean labor about Chinese intent, whether it was really just an attempt to buy the technology in order to transfer it back to China. It also gave the Shanghai automotive management a direct taste of what it's like to deal with a real labor union. And I think that might have been a particularly interesting surprise to the Shanghai automotive people, especially when the South Korean labor union had started showing up in Shanghai in order to try to make their case. So this relationship, although it has been driven primarily very strongly by high economic growth, there have also been some real challenges, I think, underlying it. And of course, now we're in a situation where we're seeing dramatic decreases in terms of exports. And so I think, or in terms of the overall trade relationship between China and South Korea. And so, you know, one of the interesting aspects of that, at least from my perspective, is whether or not it is going to be as easy for China and South Korea to manage some of the political aspects of their relationship with each other in the context of a situation where trade is possibly contracting rather than expanding. And I just want to highlight one other area of economic competition between China and South Korea, and that is competition for influence in North Korea. And I think that this chart really shows increasing shares of trade by both China and South Korea with North Korea. And I think that there is, to a certain extent, a type of competition for political influence in North Korea that is showing itself in the economic sphere. Now, my main focus was supposed to be on economics, but I did uncover one book that I want to give a brief report on before I sit down, and that is a new book published by the Korea Institute for Defense Analysis, and I'll be very brief. The title of this book is It China or Is It the United States? China's Rise and South Korea's Prospects for Stability. And they do a lot of interesting analysis. Essentially what they come out, where they come out is with the idea that increasingly there's going to be elements of difficulty and positive elements related to China's economic rise. They see China taking greater responsibility for securing regional stability as a positive thing, but they also see Chinese economic competitiveness as dangerous to South Korea. They advocate that in terms of responding to China's rise, that South Korea should try to work with China, but also try to strengthen the U.S.-ROK alliance to compensate for weaknesses, and also to expand its maritime capabilities and strengthen relationships with other countries that they say may feel the potentially burdensome effects of China's rise. And they also list a series of areas where they can envision potential conflict between China and South Korea. I'm going to list those very quickly. Territorial disputes post-unification, historical issues, maritime or EEZ-related territorial disputes. Fourth is energy development issues. Fifth is illegal fishing disputes. Sixth is issues involving Korean minorities in China. And seventh is environmental disputes. And then the last thought I really want to leave you with, essentially based on the KIDA report, is that there's a difference between the economic side of things, where there's an international regime in place that can regulate conflict, and the situation that we face on the security side. And so this might be an area that is going to be of particular interest and challenge from a South Korean perspective as they seek to grapple with China's rise. And I'll stop there.
Okay. Thank you very much, Scott. Our next speaker is Gordon Fleck. He is the Executive Director of the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Foundation, and he's also on the Advisory Council of the Korean Economic Institute of America. He's going to talk about how North Korea is viewed through this prism of the relationship between China and South Korea.
Well, thank you, Bryce. I'm likewise glad to be here today. I intentionally picked kind of a narrow slice of the topic that we're addressing today that was a little bit more obscure than the rest, where I could just kind of lay out the concerns, the rumors, and the trends. And since we have three real scholars on the panel with me, they can maybe later on tell us what it all means. But there is part of Korea-China relations that is very emotional, but it's always kind of underneath the scene. And I think if there's one narrative that's largely been missed in the discussion of Korea-China relations, it is South Korean perceptions of China's role in North Korea. Because that really deals with the future, that deals with where they're going in the future, that deals with Chinese intentions. It's interesting to me that as Scott just finished his remarks, he listed, from the KIDA book, Is It China or America, 7 kind of areas of potential conflict, and notably, North Korea wasn't listed in that, at least not that I heard, right? And yet, if you're talking about emotion and what's driving the discussion, North Korea plays a very important role in how South Koreans perceive China. In fact, over the last year, we've brought over a number of delegations of South Korean National Assembly members particularly during the course of the campaign. They would regularly want to meet with advisors to the campaign. And to a person, every member of this delegation, the thing they were most concerned about, and the thing they most wanted to talk to the Americans about, was China and China's influence on the Korean Peninsula and what China's plans were for North Korea, and rumors about Chinese intentions to invade North Korea or take over a chunk of North Korea during the course of instability in North Korea, or Chinese economic influence. And so what I thought I would do is I would try to today, in my short remarks, kind of lay out in the economic sphere, and the security sphere, and the historical cultural sphere, South Korean anxiety regarding Chinese role in the northern half of the peninsula, and then talk very briefly at the end about how that has impacted the overall Chinese perceptions of China's rise. On the economic sphere, again, Scott had a wonderful chart at the very end where he was showing that both Chinese and South Korean economic influence in North Korea, or economic investment and trade with North Korea, is increasing. What that chart didn't show, if you notice, it ended at 2007. It didn't show what's happened in the last year. The Lee Myung-bak administration has begun to pursue a radically different approach towards North Korea, one which is much more based on reciprocity. And as a result, there's just been a large dip in South Korean aid to North Korea, but also trade and economic exchanges between North and South Korea. And meanwhile, in the last year, Chinese both trade and aid to North Korea has increased dramatically. In fact, just last month there was a headline that kind of says it all in the Joseon Ilbo, South Korea's leading newspaper, that said, "North Korea's reliance on China trade deepens." Yeah, it explains it all. Another related one was, I guess the month before, in December 31st, says, "Chinese expand reach over DPRK coal." And again, over the last year and a half, there's been an awful lot of reportage in the South Korean press about Chinese long-term contracts with North Korean minerals. Chinese concern, or Chinese efforts to lock in access to North Korean, not only energy resources, but all broader national resources across the board with long-term concessionary contracts, which have largely kind of flown under the radar screen here, but have gotten a lot of attention in Seoul. And the overall concern there is, of course, first and foremost, DPRK, or North Korean economic dependence on China. In fact, during a good chunk of the last 10 years of more progressive governments in Seoul, a fundamental internal justification for inter-Korean economic relations, an internal justification for why the South Korean progressive governments were so active in aiding North Korea on what were not always purely economic terms, was that if we don't do it, the Chinese will, right? If it's not our investment, it's Chinese investment. And so if we want to block the Chinese from coming into our backyard, into our land, then we've got to do it on these terms. And so that became, again, a part of the narrative that was largely missed here in the United States. This may not be commonly viewed in this light, but back in 2002, the North Koreans attempted to open up a special economic zone in a place called Shinwiju, right along the Chinese border. And shortly as they're rolling out the plans for this, the Chinese are arrested. The special envoy representative, whatever he was titled, Yang Bin, who had been designated to be the head of this term. Now, obviously he was a crook, but most people in that region involved in that were a crook. And this was largely seen, at least in South Korea, as Chinese expression of displeasure, because they weren't consulted, that they wanted to be controlling the process, because this Yang Bin was not someone who was anointed by and approved by the Chinese. And again, seen as, from a South Korean prism, as a desire by China to control the process of what was going on economically in North Korea, even to go to the extent of reforms. If I could move briefly on then to talk about the security realm. And here we get much more into the realm of perceptions, of anxiety, of fears. There was an awful lot of reporting in South Korea when over the last 2 years, there were Chinese military exercises along the DMZ. About the deployment of 15,000 Chinese troops along the DMZ, allegedly to keep the order along the DMZ. But the perception on South Korea is that the primary purpose is pre-positioning. Now, in the event of any type of instability in North Korea, they are there not only to keep the Chinese border with North Korea, but potentially to move in and play a more proactive role. So ultimately, at its most core level, anxiety or concern over China, at least when viewed from Seoul, centers around real ambivalence, if not distrust, about what Chinese intentions are in regards to the future of the Korean Peninsula. And here there is a tension between the short term and the long term. On the official diplomatic level, South Korea welcomes and openly and actively cooperates with Beijing in the six-party talks. They need Chinese involvement to make sure that whatever happens in the short term is a soft landing, that they're not having a conflict or a collapse of North Korea. But the long-term tension with that is that the more active the Chinese role, over the long term, the greater the Chinese influence in North Korea. And so short-term necessities versus long-term interests is an ongoing debate within South Korea in regards to China. And again, the primary anxiety is in these scenarios where you really have to have contingency planning. If there is a collapse scenario in North Korea where there are different factions, what happens when the pro-China faction calls on the Chinese to come in and help? What then is the role of the Chinese military in North Korea? A lot of discussion about a Chinese plan for a buffer zone. And I talked to a lot of my Korean friends in preparation for this remark and asked them if they'd ever seen anything about the buffer zone, and they admitted they were all just reports. But the notion is that obviously for China it's far easier to control North Korean refugee flows from the North Korean side of the border than it would be from the Chinese side of the border. So rather than try to defend the river, you move in and control all major transportation hubs and networks to kind of avoid that type of a scenario. And at its root, the concern is driven in part by a growing South Korean recognition that systemic differences matter. That China does have a fundamentally different system, both economically and in terms of the government, than South Korea. And so, their concern over the Chinese role or the Chinese influence in North Korea is driven by the concern over what that would mean then for the future of the Korean Peninsula, what that would mean for their influence over North Korea. Now finally, let me touch on very briefly the historical and cultural area. And this is the one that's probably got the most press play here in the United States, but still I think is probably greatly not misunderstood, but underunderstood. In other words, not focused on nearly as much. There was a big blow-up in 2004 about the Goguryeo issue, the Goguryeo history issue. The Goguryeo was, depending on whose story you're listening to, an ancient regional dynasty or an ancient Korean dynasty, part of the original Three Kingdoms dynasty in Korean history. And the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences launched what they called their Northeast Asia Project. And the idea of this Northeast Asia Project was to look at three ancient historical kingdoms in Northeast China and to view them, look at them again, look at them under a fresh light in terms of China's history. South Koreans saw this as an attempt by China to rewrite history and to take away one of the original three kingdoms of Korea, to claim a Korean kingdom, or what South Korea viewed as a Korean kingdom, for China. And it led to a dramatic spike in anti-Chinese sentiments, anti-Chinese feelings in South Korea. In 2004, there was a Jungang Ilbo poll in February that asked South Koreans whether they had a favorable view of China. A very broad, kind of almost meaningless survey, but 86% said yes, right? By the time you got to August, after much of this broke, they had a similar poll among South Korean National Assembly members. Again, not exactly parallel, but it was down below 10%, right? Just this dramatic drop. Now, of course, it's rebounded back, and there's a lot of other numbers, and I think Victor's going to talk about some of them in length. But it really marked, in my mind, the end of the era of rose-colored glasses. After the successful normalizations of relations with China, the blossoming of earlier trade that Scott outlined, the beginning of that, the wearing off the rose-colored glasses started with the Garlic War and the Kimchi Wars, etc. But this whole question of Chinese trying to steal our historic kingdom fundamentally changed, in my mind, the prism through which South Koreans viewed China. And as a result, China became to be seen much more as a threat. In fact, one of the articles I pulled out looking to research this I thought was quite interesting. It was from a South Korean unification-focused magazine, and the title was, even though the Northeast Asian Project ends, China's history invasion will continue. Right? And so it is very much nationalistic. And the interesting thing to me is, and this I may be taking a step too far, was if any of you followed kind of diplomatic relations in the region in 2004, 2005, 2004 was a really rough time for Korea-China relations, at least on the public level, the political level. It was very quickly supplanted by a real nasty downturn in Korea-Japan relations, about the Dokdo Takashima Islands, about the Yasukuni Shrine visits, etc. Just a remarkable shift in that short period of time, right? I actually have a theory, and it's again, this is where I enjoy not being the pure scholar, the others on the table. They can substantiate or mock my theory. But I have a theory that in a country like South Korea that is so close to China and is so intimately aware of the Chinese power and influence being so close, there has a tendency to what the South Koreans call nunchi bonda, to kind of look over the shoulders and be always aware of what's going on in China, that there is a hesitance on that part to go too far, because it's not safe to go too far with a country like China. Whereas with a democratic ally of the United States, Japan, there's really not the same kind of binders or danger in terms of anti-Japanese sentiment, right? So anti-Japanese rhetoric is a lot safer than anti-Chinese rhetoric in terms of your interest, your economy, your government. And the Chinese have shown, even in the economic battles in the past, a willingness to go, not to go nuclear, to go a lot more hard line, a lot more rapidly than the Japanese and the Americans might be. And I'll give you another example, again, maybe to be disproven by the panel, but this past spring, or a year ago in the spring, when we had the whole controversy in South Korea over the torch runners and the Chinese who beat up on the South Koreans, there was a very short period of time where anti-Chinese sentiment in South Korea was spiking, only be quickly supplanted by something which is a lot more safe, anti-American, anti-beef, and other issues, which are, again, they're in the safe realm as we go that front. I would point out that these are not just sentiments alone. There are some very real and future issues here, territorial issues. There is a strong case to be made from a Chinese perspective that a lot of the Chinese moves were basically preemptive, out of concern for rising Korean nationalism, that in a post-unification scenario that Koreans would make claims on those regions of China, particularly since there is approximately 2 million ethnic Koreans living in the northeastern part of China. And so, these, what might be viewed in Seoul as very antagonistic invasion kind of driven Northeast Asia projects, from a Chinese perspective, are much more reactionary, preventative diplomacy type of efforts to try to make sure that they legitimize Chinese claims over that region to solve problems yet in the future. But the issue of the holy mountain of Baekdusan or Changbaishan, which is now kind of divided, is inevitably going to come up in any future scenario, and that's just something that's going to be part of it. There is, again, also in terms of Seoul's narrative and views of this, broader concerns about the ethnic Han assimilation of northeastern China, on that whole area in the Korean populations, the movement, perceived or not, of the Korean populations, and ever-increasing numbers of Han migrants moving to that region. Again, Bonnie and others know far more about this, but that's not necessarily unique to northeastern China. That's pretty much describes the concerns of any minority anywhere in all of China that we can go into greater detail. Let me end by just kind of citing two very brief quotes in terms of opinion polls, and I might steal a tiny bit of Victor's thunder, but he can kind of explain in greater detail. CSIS just a couple of weeks ago released a really interesting report on strategic views on Asian regionalism, where they asked kind of elite throughout the region about their perceptions. And there's just two things that I found particularly interesting in this light. That was when asked what the greatest force for peace and stability in the region was, 94% said the United States. These are of South Korean respondents. Less than 6% said China. And on the flip side of that, when asked what the greatest threat to peace and stability would likely be in 10 years, 56% said China. Only 38% said North Korea, missiles and nuclear weapons, everything, right? Interestingly enough, going back to my earlier comment, despite all the fire and all the rhetoric, 0% said Japan. And so I just think that these issues, which have flown below the radar screen here, are at least worth putting on the table when we consider Korea-China relations. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon. Our third speaker is Victor Cha, and he's the Director of Asian Studies at Georgetown University. He's also the Director for Asian Affairs in the recent Bush administration's National Security Council. And he's also author of the recent book, Beyond the Final Score, The Politics of Sport in Asia. And he's going to be discussing how South Korea views the China US dynamic in Asia.
Thank you, Bryce. Let's see if I can just find my presentation here.
Close that.
Oh, if you just close it, it should be on the desktop.
All right.
It's down here. Are you looking for full screen?
Yeah.
It's down here,
Under your head there.
under my head. Up, up.
Try the
Or
5. It's
F5,
not.
yeah.
F5 is not working. Oh, I got it. All right. Okay. Thank you, Bryce. It's a pleasure to be here. I haven't actually spoken at the Wilson Center since the last time I remember speaking here. It was still in the castle, so it's been a long time, and it's a real pleasure to be here again. I think compliments to Bryce for putting together a very good panel on a very important topic. I'm particularly happy to see Professor Sam Kim here, who's an old friend. I think one of the things that's clear just by listening to the presentations by both Scott and Gordon is that in many cases when we talk about Korea-China relations, we are explaining a change that has taken place. A few years ago, the big change was the change from the Cold War relationship to the normalized relationship. And now what a lot of people who look at this topic are talking about is a change from that normalized era in Korea-China relations to something different, in which there is much less of a, as I think either Scott or Gordon put it, much less of a rose-colored view of the relationship. I'm going to try to address some of the larger explanations as to why we've seen that change, but first let me take you through my presentation, which some of it may overlap with what both Gordon and Scott have already said. First, the conventional wisdom has always been that when the two countries normalized in 1992, there was in many ways a China revival in Korea. And you could sort of tick off the things about which people talked about in terms of this new and wonderful relationship between Seoul and Beijing. At the time, many people saw them as natural economic partners. The South Korean interest in China's economy, of course, predated the 1992 normalization, and there was quite a bit of interest among Korean companies in the 1980s. In doing more business in China, particularly small and medium-sized businesses were especially interested in getting into the China market. For reasons of geography, the normalization of relations in many ways was talked about the reconnecting of South Korea with the mainland of Asia, in a reference to the Cold War period in which Korea was sort of an island by itself, not connected to China, not connected to the mainland of Asia. The notion of normalizing relations with Beijing really created this idea that Korea was reconnected to the continent. And there was a great deal of euphoria, I think, attached to that. At the same time, there's the common Confucian heritage, the cultural ties between the two countries made people feel as though this was a very comfortable relationship. The United States was distracted in many ways in Asia, a common criticism of U.S. policy in the region, and that only further bolstered the argument that China and Korea were becoming strategically aligned. And then, some, and a number of us have written on this in the past, often with a question mark at the end of the title, the whole question of whether we were seeing a strategic drift on the part of South Korea, that after normalization, for all of these reasons, that South Korea was starting to move more into the China orbit. And some people went so far as to say that this actually represented the natural state of things in Asia, that in many ways the Cold War, when South Korea was aligned with the United States and with Japan, was really an aberration in Asia's history, and the much more natural alignment of things would be for South Korea to be a part of the Chinese orbit. But as all the speakers have said, there's really been a reevaluation of the China-Korea relationship over the years. And I think one of the ways, I mean, if we look at this, I'll show you some figures, but if we look at this, we have to ask these questions. What are we talking about when we say that China is more popular in Asia or the United States is more popular in Korea? What is some of the recent empirical evidence that we look at to talk about the China-Korea relationship? I think we find from a lot of this work that the relationship is not nearly as cozy as people think it is between Seoul and Beijing, and Scott and Gordon gave us some examples of that. And that the reasons for this are both event-driven in terms of specific issues, whether it's kimchi wars or garlic wars or the history invasion, but they're also, I think, larger limiting structural factors in the overall strength and outer limits of Sino-South Korean cooperation. So let me just show you a few of these charts, and I think many of you have probably seen versions of these charts if you've been keeping up with the literature. The first is this recent survey that was done by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. This is the soft power survey in Asia. Again, many of you may have seen this already. What I excerpted from that was particularly if you look at the bottom row, South Korean views as they scored the United States and China across these four categories of soft power that were defined by the Chicago Council survey. The scale is on a 0 to 1, with 1 being the highest. And if you look at South Korea in terms of their views of U.S. and China in terms of overall soft power, U.S. and China in terms of diplomacy, in terms of economic power, and in terms of human capital, across the board, the United States scores higher than China in terms of all of these categories. In the diplomacy category, the question, I think, was along the lines of how effective do you see diplomacy by the United States, or how effective do you see diplomacy by China? There's a little bit more parity, but you can see in terms of overall assessments of soft power, South Korea scores the United States at 0.75 out of 1, while they scored China at 0.48. And then you can see across the board the different categories. So that's one sort of bit of evidence to show how views of China have been changing. The other is this other CSIS poll that Gordon mentioned. This was a CSIS study on strategic views on Asian regionalism. The summary of the report was released last month. And again, I excerpted from this South Korean views of the United States and China. In terms of, and this is, the question had to do with views of national power within the next decade. So the time frame is actually much shorter than most of the time frames that have been done on this. They're usually out to 20, 25 years. And here again, you see in terms of South Korean views of the United States and China, in terms of overall national power, consistently the South Koreans are ranking the United States higher than China, or I should say ranking China lower than the United States. The last two columns are the ones that Gordon was referring to, which are really the most striking in terms of which country do you see as the greatest force for peace and stability over the next decade. The answer was 94% in South Korea scored the United States and 5% said China. And then the parallel question, which country do you see as the greatest threat to peace and stability in the region over the next decade? 56% said China, and 13% said the United States. The sample for the CSIS poll were policy elites, and these are weighted averages. So you can see from column column 2, U.S. China most important country, that the South Koreans may view China and recognize Chinese power, But in the end, they still see the United States as the most important force for peace and stability, and China's rise as somewhat concerning or threatening. So how do we explain these trends? How do we understand this view of China and its standing in Asia, and the fact that for South Koreans, the view of China has been less Pollyanna-ish than it has been in the past? And here, just some ideas that drawing from a group that I have been working with. APSA is the American Political Science Association, and they have a task force that has been working on the question of U.S. standing in the world. But I think there's some useful things that we can learn from this study, which will eventually be released. We just had a meeting in Charlottesville this past week. And try to understand what are some of the causes of country standing and how it's perceived in the world. And here are just four sort of metrics for that. One is the degree to which a country is perceived as complying with international rules and playing within the so-called rules of the game in international institutions and international organizations. The second metric for how a country is viewed in terms of standing is in terms of the degree to which it listens. The degree to which it is ready to listen to other countries, the degree to which it goes through consultations with other countries and is perceived to be willing to listen to the views and allow its opinions to be shaped by other countries. Third is the degree to which the country in question is willing to provide private goods to others. In other words, your views of China standing in the world, or your views as a South Korean, your views of China standing in the world, or your views of the U.S. standing in the world is greatly a function not just of style issues, right, how well the United States consults or how well it plays within the rules, but it's perhaps most importantly a function of the private goods that China or the United States is perceived as providing to South Korea. So how the country in question directly benefits your interests materially is a very important determinant of standing. And then fourth is an important determinant of standing is the degree to which a country is seen to provide not just private goods, but public goods, collective goods to the region. Examples in terms of private goods, one of the things that this group has found is that during the Bush administration, U.S. standing in Africa was actually not that bad, I mean, at least compared to other parts of the world. And there's a very good material explanation for that, which is that the Bush administration, over its term, doubled the amount of assistance that the United States provided to Africa. In terms of public goods, people talk about U.S. leadership. What made the United States a leader at the end of the Second World War and throughout the Cold War was not simply that it was providing private goods to all of these countries, in other words, opening its markets to allow recovering economies in Western Europe and Northeast Asia to export to the United States, but also because it was providing a public good or a collective good, and that was the good of security. So again, the point here is that a country, how it's viewed is greatly a function of these sorts of things. Now, if we look at the case of Korea, you can then, draw out some potential propositions that people could look at as to why Korean views of China have been declining over the past few years. And it could very well be that the Koreans do not see China as a particularly strong rule abider in international institutions, that China is not seen as a provider of private goods to the ROK. And when it comes to public goods, they're seen somewhat as a public goods provider. For example, I think the Koreans rate China's role in the six-party talks fairly highly, and as an important, as they're providing an important collective good, public good to the region. But I still think in many cases the United States is still viewed as the primary provider of public goods to the region and then to South Korea specifically. The one example I give of this, and some of my co-panelists here may have heard me say this before, but the one example that's very vivid to me about the whole public goods question was the United States' role in the 2004 tsunami. And this was particularly vivid for me because I had just left academia and gone into government to work at the National Security Council, and I'd literally come from the classroom where I was talking about China's rise in Asia and citing all these articles about China's rise. And then, on my third day at work, the tsunami hit South and Southeast Asia. And as an academic going into government, the thing that really struck me was that despite all of the talk about China's rise in Asia, when a crisis of this magnitude hit the region, the instinctive reaction of all the countries was not to look to international institutions or to look to other countries in Asia or to look to regional organizations. Everybody instinctively looked to the United States to provide the public good of leading a tsunami disaster relief operation. And as you all know, the United States led the formation of the core group of the United States, Japan, Australia, and India that played a very important role in particularly the first 72 hours of the disaster relief operation to set up infrastructure and bring important assets to the region. So, and China was not seen in that role at all. China was certainly asked to participate, encouraged to participate, but it was neither seen as a collective goods provider, nor did it have the volition at the time to be a collective goods provider. So I think some of these things, I think, again, these are just initial ideas on this. This is more an area that Scott and Sam work on much more than I. But these are just some initial ideas on how we try to explain the decline in views on China aside from the issue-specific things. The last slide I had was actually on the issue-specific things, but I had a feeling that others would cover this well. Additional factors, obviously the history factor. Gordon already mentioned the 2004 Goguryeo issue and the history, quote, history invasion, unquote, as one aspect. The other I would add is the Olympics. I think just in part because I've just written a book on this about sports and politics in Asia, so there's always an opportunity to plug the book. Unfortunately, I didn't bring the PDF of the cover with me. But, looking at this and writing that book and speaking actually to a lot of high-level South Korean policymakers when this incident happened. And the incident was the Olympic torch came through South Korea, and a lot of NGOs mobilized, as they were doing all over the world, to put pressure on the Chinese with regard to their human rights policies and things. But there were also groups out there criticizing China's human rights policies when it came to the practice of refoulement of North Korean defectors who were trying to get out of North Korea. At any rate, there was a clash between Chinese students and South Korean demonstrators that spilled into the lobbies of hotels. My own impression is that this was an incident that greatly upset many senior South Korean policymakers and legislators. And part of it could be affect, but it's not something that's going to be forgotten. I don't think that this is something that crafters of policy towards China are going to forget. And I think it will. And I think that is, in many ways, was a wake-up call to sort of what they were dealing with in China, which brings you to the second point, which is values. I think in the short term, there's a lot of euphoria in terms of Korea-China relations based on the culture variable. But I think over the medium to longer term, the values variable became more important than the culture variable. In other words, whether it was South Korean business, politics, academic exchanges, whatever it is, over the longer term, you naturally start to see difficulties, impediment, obstacles when you have a liberal democracy dealing with a non-democracy. And I think that has also been an important factor in the relationship. Final point is on structure. Sometimes we have to step back to the bigger picture. And the bigger picture in South Korea-China relations for the future is that you have two countries, a very large country and a not so large country, that are basically share a border, and eventually will share a border. So when a large country and a not so large country share a border and they're of different regime types, right, history has shown that you get insecurity spirals in those sorts of situations. Dyads in which you have big powers and not so big powers of different regime type that share a contiguous border, you get insecurity spirals. And I think we see that sort of plays through in a lot of the Korea-China relationship. Okay, I think I have like 1 minute left. Having done policy, you can't help but do something on policy implications. So let me just say very quickly, on the standing issue, I think based on what I've presented to you, the whole question of standing for China is not nearly as troublesome or difficult an issue as it is for the United States. Right? If standing is determined by how well you play by the rules and how much private and public goods you provide, this is a much bigger challenge for the United States, because China really doesn't provide that much to the region yet, but the United States does. And in the current financial situation, it's going to be harder and harder for the United States to maintain the same pace of private and public goods provision to the region as it would like. So I think in many ways, the United States has to work harder than China to maintain standing. I think for the immediate future, and we've seen it from the numbers, Korea will still view the United States as the leader in Asia. And again, as many people here have written over the past few years, this whole question of Korea's strategic drift, Korea's strategic alignment, always followed by a question mark. I think many of us were skeptical of all the people who thought, well, Korea's completely shifted in the other direction. I don't think that that's the case, and I think the question of strategic drift is not nearly as salient as it was before. The one thing that I think would be useful for all three parties is to improve three-way coordination among Seoul, Washington, and Beijing. I think that can be a positive sum game all the way around. I mean, in other words, everybody can win from having that sort of three-way dialogue. And we've seen a proliferation of these three-way, four-way, five-way, six-party dialogues in Asia now. And this is sort of one of them that is missing that could benefit all the countries. So with that, thank you very much for listening.
Great. Thanks very much. Our fourth and final speaker is Samuel Kim. He's going to be talking about how South Korea views China through the prism of national identity issues. He's a senior research scholar at Columbia University's Center for Korean Research, and he's the author and editor of several books, including The Two Koreas and The Great Powers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I will do my best to be focused on South Korea's response to the rise of China through national identity prism. There is no mistaking the special importance of the rise of China factors for South Korea's foreign policy and national identity. The combined weight of history, culture, geography, demographic, military power, political status, most recently, its re-emergence as global economic superpower virtually guarantee that China will be acknowledged as one of the most significant others in the refurbishment and enactment of Korea's national identity. Consider, for example, China's potential trump card in Korean affairs. Demographic weight as the world's most populous country, 19 times the population of Korea. Continental size as world's second largest country, 40 times the size of Korean Peninsula. Sharing 1,360 kilometer long border across almost entire northern stretch of the Korean Peninsula, modernizing military power with world's largest armed forces, albeit reduced to 2.25 million by 2004, and the world's third largest nuclear weapon stockpile, and veto power in the UN Security Council, and its new status as global economic superpower. Now, to put this notion that China has emerged as global economic superpower in local and global context, number one in growth rate over the last 30 years. I still remember reading World Development Report 1991. I think page 15 or 16 has a big table showing the winners in first, second, and third wave of industrialization. In the first wave of industrialization, UK was the winner, but it took 63 years for the United Kingdom to double its per capita output. In the second wave of industrialization, Japan was the winner, but it took Japan 34 years to double its per capita output. In the third wave of industrialization, what is often called in the literature late industrialization, China was the winner. And it took China 10 years to double its per capita output, followed by South Korea, 11 years. And China is also the world's largest holder of foreign exchange reserve of nearly $2 trillion. 2008, I think, was 1.95 trillion, but by now it's probably $2 trillion. The world's second largest economy on PP-based calculation, but even if you use conventional calculation, GDP, China surged ahead of Germany as world's third largest economy in 2007. And the world's largest trading partner for both Korea. And the extent of China's integration into global economy can be measured by percentage of GNP, trade as a percentage of GNP. And it was about 10% in 1978 when Deng Xiaoping launched the reform and opening. And come to 2006, 72.7%, compared to 48% for India, 27% for Japan, 85% for South Korea, and 26% for USA. In other words, China's economy is now more than 2 times more integrated into global economy. China escaped the most recent global financial tsunami relatively unscathed, giving rise to such monikers as non-polar world or new Chi-American era. History and geography combined has engendered a very special national identity, angst, and challenge. Thanks to its geographical location and shrimp size, throughout its history, Korea experienced more than 934 invasions for more than a century, especially between 1894 and 1953. Korea as a hermit kingdom was conquered, colonized, liberated, divided, and devastated, spawning a 3-stage mutation of its stunted identity as a shrimp among whales, from Joseon Korea to colonial Korea to divided Korea. Every Korean child learned by heart this old Korean saying, 고래 싸움에 새우가 된다. Shrimp, Korea, get crushed to death in the fight among whales. And this is abiding national identity angst. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because Big Four, or at least three of them, I'm talking about United States, China, and Japan, figure very prominently in Korean identity politics. But underscoring them all is an abiding quest to overcome Korea's historical identity as a helpless shrimp among whales. I think we can use 1988 Seoul Olympic as a benchmark event in the transformation of China's perception of ROK. And the successful conclusion of Sino-ROK normalization talk in a very short period of time in mid-1992 stand out as a textbook case of peaceful coexistence of identity differences or multiple identities. One major sticking point in the home stretch of Sino-ROK normalization talk was Seoul's request that Beijing acknowledge its past aggression, in quotation, in the Korean War. South Korean negotiators recognized that this was unrealistic request, but nonetheless made it for historic record and to ensure domestic ratification consideration. Chinese negotiator responded that there was no past issue to discuss and that any such acknowledgement, let alone apology, was out of the question. Sino-ROK normalization was made possible by the mutual acceptance and recognition of differences in political identity following China's long-standing 5 principles of peaceful coexistence and Seoul's Note politique, which called for improvement of inter-Korean relations as well as South Korea's relation with socialist countries in conformity with the principle of equality, respect, and mutual prosperity, and irrespective of political and ideological identity differences. Ironically, but not surprisingly, China and DPRK have had greater difficulties in adjusting their socialist identities in post-Cold War or post-socialist world. Now, what happened since the 1992 normalization is sequential or serial transformation in trade, political and diplomatic interaction, as well as social and cultural interaction. To such an extent that in 1992, according to a major public opinion survey, incidentally, I would take an issue with a kind of survey that projected by Victor Cha and Gordon Flake, and especially the survey of elites. Striking difference of the survey of elites as against, representative sample of the people. But anyway, in 1996, South Korean, the Ministry of Information sponsored a major public opinion survey in which 47.1% of South Koreans chose China as Korea's, quote, closest partner in 10 years, that is by 2006, in striking contrast with 24.8% for the United States. Now to 2000, November 2000, there was multinational citizens' perception of threat and influence in Northeast Asia, conducted jointly by Asahi Shimbun of Japan and Donga Ilbo in Seoul. 2 questions worth noting here. Question 1. By which country do you feel most militarily threatened? Please select one country. Okay, here, ROK, South Korea. United States, 12%. Russia, 4%. China, 7.7%. Japan, 20.7%. In other words, only 7.7% of representative sample of South Korean citizens selected China as the greatest military threat, compared to 12% for U.S. and 20% for Japan and 53% for North Korea. Second question: which country do you think will become the most influential in Asia in 10 years? That means by 2010. Again, to focus on South Korean citizens' response, 8.1% said United States, 2.1% Russia, 52.6% China, 23% Japan, and going. So it shows extent to which South Korean public perception of China has made very dramatic shift. Of course, with the intensity of economic, social, cultural interaction came the new problems and new conflicts. And Scott mentioned about garlic batters. But I want to focus on so-called Goguryeo controversy. In February 2002, China established 5-year Northeast Asian History Project. And in 2004, that project issued a report in which it disputed century of conventional wisdom of scholarship and claimed that Goguryeo was not a Korean kingdom, but rather Chinese vassal that had used the Chinese language and absorbed Chinese culture. Chinese motive for claiming Goguryeo as its own seems to evolve largely around the possibility of territorial dispute over Manchuria in the event of Korean reunification or North Korean collapse. Nonetheless, this so-called rewriting of history galvanized South Korean civil society and forced Seoul government to respond. Any attempt by outside powers such as China to deny Goguryeo is a part of Korean history can be seen as denial of Korean nationhood, an act of aggression that threatened the very existence of Korea as human collectivity. That's kind of mainstream response to this Goguryeo controversy. However, in August 2004, China and South Korea reached a 5-point verbal understanding after 9.5 hours of negotiation. Two sides agreed to make a joint effort to prevent the dispute over history from developing into a political issue. Then in September 2004, Chinese Ministry of Education acknowledged that it was, quote, managerial mistake, unquote, to say that Goguryeo Kingdom was ancient local government of China. What about the impact of Korean Goguryeo controversy? I would say that Seoul's reaction seems like a 21st century answer to the 사대주의. You know, the 사대주의 literally means serving the great, but and incidentally, North Korean translates 사대주의 as a flunkism. The Koreans, you know, but anyway, it strikes me as Seoul's reaction strikes me as its 21st century answer to 사대주의 of Joseon dynasty. In Joseon dynasty, as Carter Eckert put it in his book, a history book, I'm quoting here, to exist outside the realm of Chinese culture was for the Korean elite to live as barbarian, end of quotation. As late as early 1980, few Koreans regarded their country as equal to or independent of China. Given the ideological supremacy of 사대주의, national identity or nationalism could not rise in traditional Korea. That this historic and national identity conflict has had no visible or discernible effect on Sino-ROK security relations was made manifest in six-party process in Beijing. Unexpected source of enhancing Beijing's leverage over Washington, almost doubling it, came from Seoul. It is abundantly clear that South Korean support for Bush administration's North Korean policy has flagged substantially, partly due to the Seoul's interest in maintaining constructive and fruitful relations with rising China, but also partly due to the transformation of Seoul's approach to North Korea catalyzed by regime change in South Korean domestic politics. I'm talking about the coming of progressive Kim Dae-jung and Oh Moon-young administrations. I find this survey conducted by Chicago Council on Global Affairs in collaboration with the Asia Society really eye-openers. It's called the Global View 2000, United States and Rise of China and India, and results of 2006 Multi-Nation Survey of Public Opinion. By 2006, it is true that all the survey conducted immediately in the wake of this Goguryeo controversy, say October or November 2004, showed drastic drop in public perception of China. But come 2006, this is what you find in this Chicago Council on Global Affairs and Asia Society multinational survey. Question: feelings toward China on a scale of 0 to 100, 100 being the most warm and 0 being most cold. 61% in Australia, followed by 57% in South Korea, and 54% in India, and 40% in the United States. Feelings towards South Korea. Chinese have by far the warmest regard for South Koreans, with 73% expressing their warm feelings towards South Korea or South Koreans, followed by Australia, 56%, followed by India, 48%, followed by United States, 15%. Another question: extending UN Security Council membership to Japan, supported by 66% of Americans, 46% Indians, 18% in South Korea, and 10% in Japan. China. 18% in South Korea and 10% in China. Feelings toward Japan, 36% in China, 39% in South Korea on one side, and the other side is 58% in the United States and 64% Australia. What I'm trying to say here is that what is so disturbing, purely from a theoretical point of view, is that I regard South Korea's response as based on primordial conception of nation state or national interest. It strikes me as kind of retroactive attribution of Goguryeo as historical precursor to either Korea or Japan. This is really misconceived because it applies modern, or if you will, Westphalian concept nation-state backward to a time when modern concept nation-state was not operative in East Asia. Judging by the contemporary use of the term, the Chinese identity as mobilized in specific response to Western challenge in 19th century was more civilizational than national. For example, we find in traditional China conspicuous absence of institution for Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs was not established in China until 1903, okay? And it is this kind of situation that led prominent Chinese historian Man Shu to flatly declare that Imperial China was not a nation state. The same can be said about the traditional Korea. My time is almost up. Let me just give me a few minutes to have a few concluding remarks. Rise of China gradually making ROK government to reconfigure, readjust in Cold War alliance with the United States. Here I take serious issue with Victor Cha and other panelists here. On balance, Beijing enjoys much more positive image in the perception of South Korean elite and public than does the United States. China has become independent variable means to diversify Seoul's foreign policy options, to reduce dependency on U.S.-ROK relation, thus diminishing, if not completely erasing, its dependent identity, to secure external support for inter-Korean reconciliation and to enhance South Korean economic development, especially now that Beijing has become South Korea's top trading partner and top destination of South Korea's foreign direct investment. ROK's globalization grand strategy is based on and proceed from the three irreducible principles: security, development, and identity. There is no illusion that Korea will ever become a great power. Incidentally, you can go through content analysis of all the presidential speeches and pronouncement, and one term that you do not find: great power. Great power has become almost 30 words in Korean because Korea has been victim of great power politics. Instead, plus the fact that there's no illusion that Korea will ever become great power. Underlying logic, a recurring theme in all the presidential vision pronouncement from Kim Young-sam to Roh Moo-young remain unchanged. Globalization is the most expeditious way of overcoming Korea's historical identity as a helpless shrimp among whales. And one common if Korea does not aspire to be a great power, what does Korea aspire? My argument is this, again, expression comes again and again: advanced world-class state, which is different from great power. And here again, Chicago Council on Global Affairs Survey has very interesting finding. On is globalization good or bad? 80% of the Chinese responses is good, and 86% of South Korean respondents say it's good, compared to 60% of U.S. respondent and 54 respondent. That is to say, the globalization is enjoy the highest degree of support in China and South Korea. To explain the transformation of China-ROK relation in post-Cold era in terms of synthetic national identity theories, to argue that during the post-Cold War era of globalization, both Beijing and Seoul made remarkable adjustment in their respective national identities and role conception to establish better congruence between their foreign policies, and emerging trend in global politics and economy. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. All right, I'll now open the floor to speakers. Please be aware, because we are being webcast here, could you wait until, if you have a question, could you wait until Sue comes around to you with the microphone? And yeah, when you're speaking, you don't need to stand, but please introduce yourself. Tell us where you're from. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. I am Takeshi Watanabe, at National Institute for Defense Studies, Japan Ministry of Defense. I have two questions. One is the question to the Mr. Scott Snyder and Gordon Flake. I think this is about the South Korean concern about the Chinese influence over North Korean area. I think basically South Koreans concern over the influence of any other countries over the North Korean area, regardless of China or the United States. However, I have yet to find the South Korean initiative for the administration in North Korean area after the collapse of the current regime of North Korea. If they want to reduce the influence from others, they need such initiative. Have you ever listened to such an initiative or plan from South Koreans? And if you have yet to know, do you think what is the reason of South Korean reluctance of such an argument? And second question is a question to Dr. Victor Cha. You mentioned that the United States. You mentioned that the influence of the United States operation for the operation to help victims of tsunami. I think that is the effect of military capability on the perception of East Asian people. If so, how do you think the future effects of the improvement of Chinese naval capability shown in the Somalian piracy issue on the future regional recognition on China? Thank you.
Great. So shall we go to either Scott or Gordon first?
Okay, well, as far as I understand, the question was whether or not the South Koreans have a plan to administer North Korea. Well, we all know that there is, in fact, still an office in South Korea to administer it's called the Five Provinces Administration Office. Now, North Korea now has more than 5 provinces, but that office still remains occupied by aging individuals who came from those provinces. I don't think that represents a forward-leaning plan related to that issue. I think it represents a legacy of a desire from the past. With regard to any South Korean plan to administer North Korea, I'm not aware of any specific plan that goes into that level of detail. And I think that one could make the argument that it is probably premature to have that type of plan, but certainly the issue of contingency planning in the event of its instability has been in the news really as a result of questions about Kim Jong-il's health. So I think that event has probably led to as much attention about are we ready for a contingency as there has been speculation about who would succeed Kim Jong-il.
Let me respond just very briefly. Your question really highlights the tension I was talking about in my remarks. In the short term, no matter where you are in the South Korean political spectrum, you don't want short-term abrupt unification because the costs are astronomical. So, although not spoken directly, the primary policy of the South Korean government remains to stabilize North Korea, to prevent abrupt unification and the costs that come with that. And as such, right now, particularly when the North-South relations and economic aid and stuff are cut off, there's probably a certain degree of relief on South Korea side that China is providing that aid and stepping in, because that reduces the chance of instability of North Korea, and they're picking up the cost. But in the long term, there is that nagging concern about what comes with that price tag, right? What price tag comes with that aid or assistance, and that is rising Chinese influence over the long run. So again, it's just a perfect example of that tension.
The question was on Chinese capabilities, naval capabilities, and their demonstration of that in places like Somalia, off the coast of Somalia and things, and how it impacts the way countries in the region view China. Well, I think theoretically speaking, as China's naval capabilities grow, they will be capable of providing for the public good, whether that's in terms of freedom of navigation or things of that nature. But there are two components to being perceived as a collective goods provider in a region. You have to have the capabilities, but you also have to have the will or the intentions to do that. Up until this point, I think the country that's perceived as having both of those things now still remains the United States, and for the foreseeable future, I think it will still remain the United States. I think part of that has to do with a lag that exists between what countries perceive and the actual capabilities of the collective goods provider. But I think it also has to do with the fact that China doesn't see itself as ready to be in that position. And it's probably going to be a while before they do. The whole responsible stakeholder idea or concept was in part informed by this notion of China becoming more of, conforming more to international norms and rules and institutions, which in essence would start to make them more of a collective goods provider in the region. So I think that's certainly the trajectory that they're on, but it's a very slow, it's a very long timeline, I think.
Eric McFadden, the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis. Gordon, I believe you used the expression buffer zone. Did you mean the country of North Korea being a buffer between China and the South, or some other definition like a band of PLA troops or what have you? And what brings it to mind for me is I've heard in recent years various Chinese views of whether buffer zone is still a valid concept and various definitions of it and so forth. But anyway, which did you mean and what are the implications?
I was probably a poor choice of words, but I was really referring to just a narrow band along the northern border of North Korea with China. So right now that border is largely divided by rivers, and it would be very difficult for China to police if the intent of the Chinese in the event of a contingency in North Korea was to prevent refugee flows or instability in that region. And so the theory, whether it's real or not, I don't know, and it may be a conspiracy theory among South Koreans concerned about this, is that China has an intent of making a buffer zone along that northern border, not the more traditional definition of buffer zone that you're talking about. It's interesting, though, that you raise it and that we had a panel here about Korea-China relations, and no one mentioned that concept, because 10 years ago, if we had the same panel, that would be kind of the standing gospel about Korea-China relations. China is opposed to unification because it wants to keep North Korea as a buffer against, the capitalist world outside there. And there is a debate, I think, among Chinese and others as well, as to whether or not that notion still has the same saliency today that it did 10 years ago. I'm probably among those that thinks that China at this point is so self-centered and so self-confident that notion no longer holds the same weight or importance to them as it did 10, 15 years ago.
Okay, next question. Up the back there, Sue.
Hi, my name is Sonam Park from Brookings Institution, and good to see you all over here. And when we discuss about not the ROK-Chinese relations, but rise of China and its impact on the ROK and Chinese relationship, then I think our discussion could be completely different. Because in 2002, there was some anti-American demonstration, and 2004, anti-China sentiments prevailed, and 2005 and 2006, anti-Japanese mood also rise very high, and 2008, anti-Americanism came again. But that's the very sensitive reaction of South Korean public towards the neighboring big major powers in terms of a survival and their prosperity. But when we think about the rise of China, then the Lee Myung-bak government and South Korea will face new risks and opportunities in 5 key areas like economy, security, bilateral military relations, political relations, and also North Korean questions. So I'd like to hear about what really the rise of China means to your mind in analyzing Korea and Chinese relationship, comparing with the previous period. Because I feel that recently China is clearly rising, even replacing in the role of United States, at least in the Northeast Asian region. Thank you.
You wrote the book on it.
Well, yes, but I didn't really have a chance to cover the Lee Myung-bak period. I mean, one of the very, I think, interesting developments over the course of the past year has been Lee Myung-bak's, during his first year in office, travel here to Camp David in the United States, and he talked about a strategic alliance for the 21st century. And this gave the impression that there was going to be, some people may have thought that that was a kind of reversion to the old South Korean foreign policy, which was very U.S.-centric. But it only took 1 month for Lee Myung-bak to go to Beijing and then declare a strategic cooperative partnership, which raises the question, I think, for some people in the United States, okay, well, what does this mean? Is there a tension between the idea of a strategic cooperative partnership with Beijing and a strategic alliance with the United States? I believe that South Koreans don't necessarily see those two concepts as mutually contradictory with each other. In fact, they are desperately hopeful that those two concepts can be aligned with each other, because the core objective, I think, for South Korea in dealing with the U.S. and China respectively is not to have to make a choice. I think that's basically the core foreign policy objective vis-a-vis, that broader, if you will, structural feature of South Korea's security environment, because they know that if they have to make a choice, then something bad has happened in their security environment that is having a direct impact on South Korea. But then it remains to be seen, I think, how the Lee Myung-bak administration is going to kind of flesh this out. What is it really going to mean? And to me, the most interesting aspect to watch is going to be how South Korea moves forward to manage its security and military relationships with China, because that's a new area that has been essentially, if you will, opened up by the idea of a strategic cooperative partnership. And so I think we'll just have to see how that plays out. But that would be, I think, my effort to explain maybe how the Lee Myung-bak administration has maneuvered so far and where it sees the opportunities and challenges that Korea is facing in that context.
Okay, next over here.
My name is Young-hwan Keo, currently at Georgetown University as a visiting scholar. I really enjoyed this roundtable discussion on China's rising and its implication. And I will make two comments. Number one, I was thinking of somebody's missing in this panel, that is David Kang, Rising China, and he takes much more kind of a different perspective. That's my understanding of reading his book published last year or 2 years ago. But while listening to each of your very perceptive analysis, and then your flyer here I read is billed as U.S. and the South Korean perspectives on China's rise, that is, are very complex. Indeed, I have seen a different perspective of realism on the one hand, constructivism on the other, perhaps David Kang's more what I call kind of idealistic perspective has not been reflected. So my question then is as follows. Speaking of nationalism, I know that the South Korean nationalism is more ethnic type, ethnic nationalism, as title of Shin Gyu-uk's book indicates, for instance. And none of you addressed the minority issue, Korean Chinese minority issue in China as a kind of a factor in terms of China's perception of what's happening in the Korean Peninsula today and the future. So my question is there any difference between Chinese nationalism and Korean nationalism? Does China have a nationalistic sentiment, or is it Han nationalism, or is there any other subtypes of Chinese nationalism on the one hand? Is it compatible with what the Korean ethnic nationalism entails? Thank you.
Sam, do you want to take that one?
Well, my response to that, and you can see this public opinion going up and down, all of it shows that national identity projection is time-specific and situation-specific. So anytime when another country does something that is perceived as threatening, it triggers, this kind of nationalistic response. Now, as for the handling of this, there was a controversy generated by South Korean National Assembly trying to pass a dual citizen bill that triggered negative response, not only from China, but Kazakhstan, where you have large ethnic Koreans. But the issue is especially sensitive in the case of China, because China has, 55 national minority, and even though Joseonjok, Chinese Koreans are often projected as a model nationality, it triggers from time to time some dispute, especially when you have so many South Korean missionaries, teachers, business entrepreneurs, moving to Yanbian area, and this kind of increasing human interaction is bound to create some kind of controversy. But I think both Seoul and Beijing realize that this issue has to be managed through mutual consultation, cooperation, so as not to spill into the area where they have common interest. So my sense is that it's not the issue that would trigger serious crisis in the relationship between the two. And related to that is somebody asked a question about China's role in North Korea. My sense is that in the short run, short to medium term, I think South Koreans will agree with China that China is stepping in, part of what is called resource diplomacy, and prevent the collapse of North Korea. And it goes a long way in stabilizing situation in North Korea. And so I think in the short run, I think instead of being afraid about the rising influence in North Korea, I think many South Koreans accept this as kind of service that they could not provide by themselves.
Okay, Victor, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, on this point about China's role in North Korea and the extent to which they are investing more in the country in order to gain control of the mineral resources, and there are a lot of them in North Korea. I think that's certainly the perception. I haven't yet seen a real systematic study of how much the Chinese really are beginning to own a majority controlling share of in North Korea. It was certainly an argument that has been used to justify in the past South Korea's sunshine policy or engagement policy with North Korea, that it was incumbent upon South Korea to take steps to become a more important part of the North Korean economy in order to prevent that. So it's clearly an idea, it's an argument that's been out there, but I still don't know what the actual numbers on that look like, and maybe Scott has seen numbers on this. The second point, going back to Park Sun-won's question about, he's basically saying, it seems to him that we've been through this period of, anti-Americanism, then there was some anti-Chinese, and then in 2008, I assume you're referring to the beef stuff and anti-Americanism, and that he senses that there's a rise of China now. And I think that's often, I think that is the view of a lot out on both in the street and in the elite about where China's positioning vis-a-vis the United States and the South Korean mindset. That's why I thought the polling that we saw both from the Chicago Council soft power survey and from the CSIS poll were so interesting because, granted the CSIS poll is a policy elite poll, but the Chicago Council survey is not just policy elites. And it shows, contrary to what many people think, that the Chinese are not doing as well with South Korea as
the 2006 poll was the citizens, the public opinion, not the elite.
Right.
You're talking about 2009.
Yeah, I'm talking about the 2008 Chicago Council soft power survey, which again scored China relatively lower than what many people thought would be the case.
That's elite perception, right? Not public opinion.
No, that's Chicago Council soft power survey. So it's a
survey of what? The
CSIS poll was an elite poll.
Yeah.
This Chicago Council Global Affairs 2008 soft power survey was not just elites.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. The second point on this, I think, when we look to the future is, like I said, I think perhaps the most important variable for, if we're focusing just on South Korean views of China, perhaps the most important salient variable is the financial crisis, because that is going to have all sorts of impacts on the way the United States can provide public and private goods around the world. And that's naturally going to impact the view of the United States around the world. Now, obviously, with the election of President Obama, there's an uptick. Everybody around the world has a different view, a much better view of the United States than they did at the end of the Bush administration. But I think what's coming down the road is, with that extremely positive view that President Obama has around the world now, comes greatly heightened expectations among all countries in the world about what the United States can, should be able to do. And what people don't realize is that perceptions and expectations of the United States are always much higher than they are of any other country in the world. So what that means is every other country in the world out there expects that the United States they take for granted that the United States will provide what it's providing today. And they expect that the United States should be providing more in the future. And the financial realities are it's going to be very difficult to do that. Meanwhile, China is sitting there and has not provided a lot, so they're starting from a very low baseline of expectations. And while they too are facing financial constraints, there will be an opportunity for them to do more things in Asia while the United States is hamstrung at home. So I think looking down the road, there's a potential for U.S. standing to go down, not because of anything it's doing, but because of things that it's not doing.
I'll just add 2 points. One is related to the Chicago Council poll and other polls, and that is that it seems to me that if you compare over time the changes, the trend line does suggest that Korean feelings toward China are going down. Chicago Council poll from 2006 rated China at 57 degrees, and the one from 2008 rated China at 50 degrees. So there is a cooling in terms of feeling, and both of those polls are were conducted in the same fashion by the same institute in South Korea. The second thing I wanted to say is related to what might be going on the China-DPRK border. There are numbers related to Chinese investment in North Korea that showed a spike in 2007, and these were most likely related to natural resource investments. But, we've been talking about the global crisis, and if you think about what is going to be the implication, I think the Chinese motivation to get into those energy markets in North Korea were really related to China's global search for energy. But if energy is cheaper, are they really going to be as motivated today as they were a year or two ago to try to develop resources that are so difficult to get as those that are in North Korea? So I don't have any further empirical data, but I think that the logic would suggest that it's likely that there would probably be a downturn in terms of the development of energy resources by China.
You mean the minerals, not energy?
Well, there's minerals, and there's also hydroelectric and coal that are that we know that there are Chinese joint ventures with DPRK firms inside North Korea.
Yeah, but as I recall, I may be wrong. Chinese investment in North Korea went from 10 million to 100 million, so there's a huge jump
from a low base.
Because the
That's
base
correct.
was so low.
Sure.
So 100 million is what, drop in a bucket.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I want to just add what Victor Cha has said. In the wake of this recent global financial crisis, so-called Chiang Mai Initiative, called ASEAN Plus 3, the currency swap among three, Tokyo, Seoul, and Beijing, went up to about $80 billion. So I think we really in 1997, 1998 so-called Asian financial crisis. I think there's a tremendous feeling of letdown, and South Korean even misleading called this IMF crisis. It was not IMF crisis, but the feeling that and China received a tremendous approval because of refusal to, appreciate its yen. But in the recent crisis, I think people are talking about Chinese model. That now that China has world's largest foreign exchange reserve, nearly $2 trillion, I think they are now looking to China to step in and provide this the currency reserve, about $80 billion. That'll go some way to cushion any possible rise of a second Asian financial crisis. So there is a movement underway, and in this kind of situation, you see that the national identity conflict, the differences sort of put aside as Tokyo, Seoul, and Beijing cooperate to establish this common reserve fund.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing there is that and this is what the CSIS survey showed, is that the one area in the region where there is greater regional interest in regional solutions is on this issue of financial liquidity. And I think that is linearly a function of the fact that the United States was not seen to be the country that was providing for the public good in terms of helping to solve that problem in the 97-98 crisis. On every other thing, pandemics, tsunami relief, security, all these other things, the region overwhelmingly polled in favor of obviously national capabilities, alliances with the United States and international institutions. But on this one issue where the United States was perceived as failing to provide the collective good, the regional solution among the countries seems to be much more popular. I don't know what that has to do with Korea and China, but
Okay, great. If there are no more questions, we'll wrap things up there because it's just gone 5:30. So I'd like you please to extend your gratitude to our four speakers for coming here to talk to us today.